All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stanley Chang, and it's a pleasure to have you today on Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis. Our guest is Alfred Twu, an architect based in Berkeley, California, where they have lived since 2002. They have worked on housing issues in California at the state and local levels in organizations like the California Democratic Renters Council, East Bay for Everyone, and more recently, an appointed member of the Berkeley Planning Commission. They also do beautiful and information-packed renderings and drawings of urban environments for public education purposes, which we're looking forward to seeing today. Alfred, welcome to Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis, and please take it away.
All right. Thanks, Stanley, for an introduction. So for many of you who've been following Senator Stanley Chang, you'll probably have heard of this idea of 1,000 homes per acre as a goal to aim for. And often we talk about it from the housing shortage point of view. But today I'm also going to talk about it from the convenience point of view. And if you live near a lot of people, then there's going to be a lot of things that will be close by, whether it's shopping or public services. And then we will also look at several illustrated examples of what different levels of density look like, all the way from 1 up to 1,000 homes per acre. So with that, I will start this slideshow. Here we go. You all see it? Okay. So when I was talking earlier about how you need lots of people living nearby to support different businesses, one thing we need to remember is just how much physical space housing requires relative to office buildings or stores and restaurants and other public services. One way to think about it is that if you've got a standard 1-bedroom apartment right here in yellow, that's about 600 square feet of space for a bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom, and the hallways. Now, if you're looking at an office or a cubicle or a desk someone's working at, that's only about 100 square feet. So right there, every time you see one office building, you know that there's got to be at least 6 apartment buildings of the same size so that the people who work in that building have somewhere to live. Likewise, if you think about retail space, generally, we have about 20 square feet of retail space per person in this country. In other countries that aren't as spread out and suburban, it's closer to about 5 square feet per person. And so if you're thinking about how little 5 square feet is, that's not even half a store. If you want to have a variety of businesses available in your neighborhood, it's going to take a lot of customers to support that. And the same is true for things such as public services, whether it's libraries, schools, hospitals, as well as public transportation, such as buses or trains. So a couple of easy numbers to remember is that to have a corner store, you need about 1,000 households living nearby to support that. And for some basic personal services, whether it's something like a barber shop or things like that, you need about 2,000 people. And then for something like a supermarket, as well as all the other basic necessities in life, like hardware stores, banks, and so on, you need about 6,000 households. And here we have an example of a neighborhood. It's about a half mile square on each side, which works out to about 5 to 8 blocks, depending on the size of the block. in which way you're looking at. And this is a good size of a neighborhood because it's small enough that you can walk pretty much anywhere in about 15 minutes. And so it's small enough that everything in this neighborhood is something where you don't have to really plan a trip to go there. If you need to go somewhere, you just go downstairs and you go, and you can be back home in less than an hour. So this is about half a square mile. It's a half a square mile long, half a square mile wide, and a quarter of a square mile in area, which works out to about 160 acres. Now, about a third of that land is going to be taken up by the streets. And then of the remaining blocks, maybe about half of them will be places where people live, and the other half will be things like schools, factories, parks, everything else. And so we're looking at a neighborhood which has about 20 blocks of either pure housing or mixed use buildings, which are buildings where you have stores on the ground floor and people living above. So if you look at cities in the past, you often look at these paintings of old cities that were done hundreds of years ago, and it looks really lively. There are people everywhere on the streets, there are lots of businesses, and yet the buildings are very small. And the simple explanation for that is that standard of living was much lower back then. And you would often have entire families living in one room instead of having a whole home to themselves. And so it's because of that, there was a lot of people, even though there weren't a lot of buildings. Today, obviously, our standards are a little higher. We have the ability to do that. There's no more need to cram ourselves into such tiny spaces. But at the same time, if we want to have neighborhoods where there are enough people around to support all the conveniences of living in a city, it does require there to be more homes. So even today, there are some places that still have a lot of people and can support the busy street life. And these include tourist areas, downtown areas, college towns, as well as immigrant neighborhoods. And what these places have in common is they either rely on having visitors coming into that area and or overcrowded housing in order to get the number of households up to that level where there are enough customers to support different businesses as well as transportation and public services. And the way you can think about it is that in a tourist area, you have these hotels, and families who are on vacation might only be taking up one hotel room. And so it can be very high density. Similar thing in college towns where you have dorms where there might be 2 or 3 students living in each room. So one thing I want to make very clear is that there's a difference between overcrowding and density. So overcrowding is when there are too many people in each building. And you can have overcrowding even with low density. And it's actually quite common in a lot of places where there's a housing shortage or where housing costs are very high. So for example, if you have a regular house with 2 bedrooms and 15 people living in it, that's going to be overcrowded, even though from a density point of view, it might be very low density. On the other hand, if you have a tall building there, and then there's enough space so that everyone has their own apartment, that's high density, but low crowding. So in general, more density means less overcrowding. And it's a great way to have all the conveniences of living near lots of people without the overcrowding problem where you don't have enough personal space. All right, so we're about to now go into the technical part of this presentation where we will look at some different density levels all the way from 1 to 1,000. And here are some assumptions to go by. When we count density, we count units. And by units, we mean homes. And generally in planning, units are defined as having 1 kitchen equals 1 home. And if you really want to get into the details, 1 kitchen equals 1 stove. And so for that purpose, we are going to assume that we're going to use standard apartments and houses for this calculation. Obviously, in most cities, you have a variety of living situations. You will have dormitories, you will have other forms of group housing as well. But the majority of people do live in individual apartments, either with their family, by themselves, or with roommates. And so for that purpose, we will use the standard apartment just because it's something people are familiar with. And also, to make sure this is a real apples to apples comparison, and we're not comparing different unit sizes. For all the illustrations, we are assuming that the homes are 3 bedrooms, 1,200 square feet. That's generally a modest sized house. It's a bit on the large size for apartments. You'll find that often in new apartment buildings. There's more 1 bedrooms and studios being built because there are more people living by themselves today. But to make sure that we are clear in comparing what different density levels look like. And also because in our day and age, we should aspire to having more space for people, whether it's so they have room for a home office or a room for guests or family members who might be needing a place to live temporarily. We should aim to have enough homes so that people can have more space if they want. And so is that, let's take a look. So the other assumption is how big is 1 acre? So block sizes vary and lot sizes vary, but your typical lot in the United States is going to be a rectangle with the short end on the street and the long end perpendicular to it. In some older areas closer to downtown, you might have lots that are as small as 40 feet wide and 100 feet deep. In more suburban areas, you'll see larger lots that might be 60 feet wide and 150 feet deep. I took kind of an average of these. So what you see here are lots that are 50 feet wide and 125 feet deep, and there are 7 of them grouped in this outline. It's about 1/3 to half of a block. And so when you think about your neighborhood and how big an acre is, just think about how much space about 5 to 7 to 8 houses takes up. And if you think about how big a block is, this example here is drawn on a block that is 250 feet in the short direction and 400 feet in the long direction. And so a little less than half of it is 1 acre. So what do certain numbers of homes on an acre look like? So that is the next part. So let's start at the bottom, at 1 house per acre. So this is generally one of the lowest densities you will find in any urban area. It's typically more common in the countryside, but sometimes in the city, you might find suburban estate zoning designed for mansions that is 1 house per acre. And as you can see on the picture on the left, it is a lot of space. We're talking about a yard that is about 200 feet in each direction. It's quite a lot of work just to maintain that. So you don't really see this too often. If we move up to 5 homes per acre, now this is starting to get into your classic American suburb, where you've got houses with relatively small side yards but large backyards. And you can see here from the street and from the side what it looks like. So next, we're going to go double that to 10 homes per acre. And this is where things start to get more interesting. There's more variety of options to get there. You can have duplexes, for instance, or you could have 2 houses on a lot. Sometimes they might be on the same lot. Sometimes they might be divided into 2 separate lots so that each person has their own land as well as house. In some places, the house in the back has a narrow strip of land connecting it to the street. And because of the shape, they can be called flag lots or battle axe blocks, because you've got a long stick with the wide part in the back. Some cities, like in California, San Francisco is like this, instead has very skinny lots that might only be 25 feet wide. The 10 homes per acre is still visually looks a lot like 5 homes per acre, but that doubling in density makes a big difference. It's at this point, you have enough people to support some basic public transportation, such as having a bus that comes frequently enough that you can rely on it. But this is still not quite enough to really support any retail. And so if you look at neighborhoods that are built in this pattern, you'll still find that most of them are purely residential, and even where stores are allowed, they're often far away that you have to drive to them. So let's go up to 20 homes per acre. So from the street, as you can see on the top right, this still visually looks pretty similar to 10 homes per acre. It's still something you can do with 1- and 2-story buildings. And there are many ways you can do this. You can do what are called small lot subdivisions, where a residential standard suburban lot is divided up into many small lots. This is something that you can see in Los Angeles, and worldwide you see this type of pattern very common in Japan. Japan, as we know, has many high-density cities, and often the famous pictures are of their downtowns with the larger buildings, but most of their people actually live in single-family housing. It's just that the lots are much smaller. The way I like to think about it is, if somebody only needs 1,000 square feet of house, they shouldn't need 5,000 square feet of land with that house on. And that's the idea with small lot subdivisions. In Los Angeles, for instance, you'll sometimes see these small lot subdivisions where the lot is only about 700 square feet. That's still plenty of space for a 2- or 3-story house with its own yard. Now, this is also 20 homes per acre is also where you will see townhouses and garden apartments and also corner stores. Because at this point, if you've got, remember how I said there are 160 acres in that quarter mile of a neighborhood, and that about 1/3 of that land is available for housing. Well, on those 50 or so acres, if you have 20 homes per acre, that's 1,000 households, which is enough to get you your corner store. So this is the beginning of the point where you can start to have these multi-purpose neighborhoods where you can actually get some of your basic shopping done without having to go somewhere else. And next, we will go up to 50 homes per acre. So this is sort of a doubling of the density versus 20. And like before, where I mentioned that at 1,000 households, you can have corner stores, and at 2,000, you can start having a greater variety of small businesses. This is the density that gets you there. So here you can start supporting different kinds of businesses. And there are many different types of buildings that get you to about 50 homes per acre. You can have these smaller townhouses. If you look at a lot of the East Coast cities on the mainland, like places like Philadelphia or Boston or New York, you'll see a lot of streets where they have row houses that are fairly narrow and about 2 or 3 stories high, but a bit longer in the back. And that gets you up to about 50 homes per acre. You can also have these smaller apartment buildings, like the one here with 3 stories. And then alternatively, if you want more green space for yards and gardens, this is also where the tower in the park model gets to, where you've got these larger lots where the buildings might only take up about 1/4 of the land, and the rest of it is open space. All right, and next we will go up another doubling, this time to 100 homes per acre. So as we mentioned before on how it takes a few thousand people to have a supermarket, 100 homes per acre is the point where your neighborhood can have a supermarket and can have all the typical other businesses you would normally find in a supermarket shopping center nearby. And getting here requires either these mid-rise apartments, maybe 4 to 5 floors, or you often see this in a lot of places, especially in Hawaii, these towers in the garden, which they're a little bit bigger than the towers in the park, and they take up a bit more of the space, but there's still significant amounts of garden space around them. So I would say that while you can go up all the way to 1,000, and there are definitely cases where you want to, for a lot of places, 100 homes per acre will get you most of the benefits of the conveniences of city living. So why do we need to go more? Well, not every block is going to change. And if you think about it, there are certain places where we may not want to have high density development. Over here in California, for instance, there are places where there might be an earthquake fault line, there might be wildfire hazards. Every place has its natural hazards. There might also be historic neighborhoods you want to preserve. And so in places where entire new cities are being built, the 100 homes per acre is often a popular model. This is what you see in Europe, where when you go to the edge of a city, you go straight from farmland to these mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings, because they're building new neighborhoods from scratch that are dense enough to support all the services and businesses that it might need. But in the United States, because of our suburban era of development, we've already paved over most of the land that's within a reasonable distance from our downtowns. And we really don't want to take up too much more of the farmland and open space we have left. And so instead, we must do the more complicated work of infilling into existing areas. And so if you've got a neighborhood that's only 10 homes per acre, and that's pretty common for a lot of suburbs, whether in Hawaii or California or elsewhere. If you want to get it up to that 100 homes per acre to support all the conveniences of modern life, then you will need to bring some of the blocks up even further if you're not going to change all of that. So that's what we're going to look at next, going up to 200 homes per acre. So 200 homes per acre, this is when you start getting into much larger buildings, because once you get to the taller buildings, you do need things like more elevators and more stairs and other things where it's just more economical if they're also a bit larger. But that doesn't mean that they have to completely look very downtown and urban either if you don't want that. One thing you can do with a taller building is to move it back a little bit from the street and have townhouses in front. There are a lot of great examples of this in Vancouver, where they will have taller apartment buildings surrounded by townhouses. And so from the point of view on the street, you will still see these smaller scale buildings in front of the large ones, like you see here on the right. On the mainland of the US, you see a lot more mid-rise apartment buildings where the lower floors are made of concrete and the upper floors are made out of wood. That's a little less common in Hawaii, but it's a pretty common pattern in California, for instance, because of the lower cost of building with wood. But that's also from a purely visual point of view. If you don't want to have very tall buildings, but you still need to get more homes into land, these mid-rise blocks are a pretty common way to do it around the world. A lot of the more famous European cities are built primarily like this, with 8-story buildings around a courtyard. All right, and next we're going to go into the high-rise part of the presentation with 500 homes per acre. So at this point, we are really looking at high-rise apartment buildings, usually 20 to 40 stories. And at this point, there are enough people living in each building that just from the residents alone, it's possible to get some businesses in that area with enough customers. And so these type of developments are actually quite useful if you are near, for example, a rail transit station, or if you're near a college, or any other kind of facility where you want there to be different businesses and services available nearby. And so even if the surrounding neighborhood might still be low density, it's often common for the area right outside the train station to have taller buildings. And finally, of course, is keeping with the 1,000 homes per acre. This is what it looks like. And these are not small apartments. These are the 1,200 square foot, 3-bedroom apartments, 1,000 of them. And this is pretty much the limit of what our current construction technology will get us to, where we've got these skyscrapers that they're not as tall as the ones in Manhattan, but they're still pretty tall, like over 40 stories high. But that's what it takes to get 1,000 homes per acre. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Alfred, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. You help us to make these concepts concrete and not just abstract. It's very easy to see with your renderings exactly what these neighborhoods would look like. And so my first question would be, which of these do you think is best for most US cities?
Well, I would say that every city is going to require a mix of all of them. Like, every city will have some places where you want to go all the way up to 1,000. And then you'll also have some places where just going up to 10 or 20 homes per acre is enough. And I think it really comes down to how bad the housing crisis is, whether there's any further land left to expand outwards, as well as when you're looking specifically at a location, is this near existing businesses and homes, or is this out in the middle of nowhere? And again, I just want to go back to this chart here, where if part of the goal to having more housing is also to make it so we don't need to drive everywhere, that perhaps every neighborhood needs at least some higher density spots, just so that there's a neighborhood center that can support some businesses and services.
Okay, we're starting to get some questions in the chat. And so to our audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function to input your questions for Alfred Twu. All right, our first question from the audience: what elements do you recommend including to help build community at the different density levels?
Sure. So I think the most important thing to realize is that a city is made up of more things than just housing. So I'll go back to this picture here, where this is a typical neighborhood. The yellow is the housing, the blue is other things like schools, parks, and other places people go. And that's what you really need for a complete neighborhood. If you look at the history of housing in the US, one of the reasons that the public housing of the 20th century was not very successful in many places was because the buildings were built far away from jobs and other things. And so people moved out as soon as they could, and it wasn't a popular place to live except for people who had no choice otherwise. And so when we looked at building community at different density levels, whether it's low density or high density, it's important that not everything is housing, that there's also space for parks and schools, community centers, and all that.
Okay, another question from the audience. What are your thoughts on the European style of housing development with shops on the bottom, several stories of housing on the top, and specifically the Spanish superblocks for creating neighborhood businesses and housing?
Sure. So I think that's an excellent model where especially we've seen in a lot of cities during the pandemic is they've closed off some of the side streets for people to have recreational space. And I think the Superblock is a great idea because you do need some faster, heavier traffic streets for getting from one side of town to the other. But there's also a value in having quieter streets in between them that provide a public space as well as a safe place for people to walk around their neighborhood without having to be on a busy street. And you also know that different types of businesses will prefer the different types of streets. If you're a business like a gas station, you'll want to be on a busy street because that's where your customers are. But if you are a neighborhood cafe, you'll prefer the quiet side street. So again, it's having a mix of different options in each place.
So the issue of transportation has already come up. And so we have two questions that might be related. Could you talk a bit about the role of the car in transportation at each of these different levels of density? And we also have an audience question about the role of micromobility in newer high density housing development.
Sure. So, mhm. Uh, oops. So at lower density levels, it's where the car is often the primary way of getting around, for example, and where you're only at one home per acre, you've got the big driveway, you got to drive everywhere. And it's definitely becomes a challenge where there's a chicken and egg problem, where until you've got a certain amount of density, you don't have the businesses yet. They're often the last part to open in a new development or neighborhood. And so the key thing is to make sure that the transportation and the businesses are encouraged to move in at the same time that the housing goes in to minimize the need for driving. Because once you get above 20 homes per acre, driving does become a challenge if everybody's trying to drive everywhere. And with micromobility, such as the electric scooters, I think they are a key part to it. It's not the only solution. They're not going to be useful for everyone or for every trip, but they can be pretty convenient, especially for the more unusual trips. I feel with mass transportation, just from the name, you require there to be a lot of people going from point A to point B. So it's great if you're going to the mall or going to work downtown. But if you're going to your friend's house from one side of a neighborhood to another side of another neighborhood, that can be an inconvenient trip to make by mass transportation. And it can be hard for mass transportation to make that convenient just because it's not a trip that a lot of people are going to be making. And so that's where the micromobility really can be useful.
So as you know, one of the hot topics for those of us in the pro-housing community is densifying existing neighborhoods, say taking a neighborhood where you have one home or 5 homes per acre and allowing greater density either through ADUs, through lot splits like SB9 in California, and so on. As you already mentioned, when you do increase the density, there are issues like greater traffic congestion. And so, this has been a controversial issue, to say the least, in places like California and Hawaii. What would you say to those who would resist densifying existing neighborhoods because of the impact on those existing residents in increasing their traffic, the parking, the noise, the congestion, and so on?
Sure. So in Berkeley, where I live, we came up with a good compromise around this issue, where in places where we already have parking shortages, we have what's called the residential parking permit system, where basically you have to live in that neighborhood to be able to park long-term on the street. And then your first permit is reasonably priced, but if you need, say, more than 3 permits, for instance, then they start getting really expensive, because the point is to make sure that there's enough space to go around. And one of the compromises the city made when allowing more housing into these neighborhoods was saying that for the new buildings, they would be required to do what's called transportation demand management, where the property manager gives all their residents bus passes, and at the same time, residents of that building are not eligible to get parking permits to park on the street. And so that goes a long way in reassuring people that just because there's a new building coming to the neighborhood, they're still going to be able to find parking on the street, which is understandable as something that we need to do, because at least in California, a lot of our older buildings don't have garages. And so if someone who's already living there needs a car to get to work, they're still going to need parking in the meantime. And by requiring that the new buildings do not get parking permits. That helps self-selects for new residents that have set up their lives and live and work in places that they can rely on walking to work or taking a bus. And from that first group of residents, that then builds up enough people in the neighborhood to start supporting more jobs and services within the neighborhood itself. And so later on, the next batch of people who move in, it becomes an even easier choice to not have to rely on driving everywhere.
So those are still changes that we're proposing, a parking management system.
Mhm.
Let's say a community is a fairly rural one, and let's say they are the 1 house per acre or 5 house per acre levels. And they just don't want change at all. They like the way that things are, and they don't want to have to register for a permit if, the son moves back home for a year or two, or if, they want to, they enjoy their low traffic lifestyle. What would you say to communities like that one?
So for the rural communities where we might only be at 1 or 2 homes per acre, those should probably stay that way for the most part if they're truly rural areas. And that's actually one of the main reasons that we want to see new homes being built at higher densities instead of turning more of these rural areas into what we call these suburban ranches, where it feels rural, but the land is obviously not large enough for someone to actually make a living as a farmer on it. And that's sort of the worst of both worlds, where it's too spread out to ever be convenient, but at the same time, it's useless for actual agriculture because the lot is too small to grow enough things. And so I think to those people, you can say that, what we're trying to do is to help keep your rural lifestyle and preserve it from people moving out there from the city by providing the homes in the city itself. One place where it could be useful to have more density in rural areas is have these cluster town centers that are at this 20 homes per acre level, where this might be where the regional bus stop is that takes people to the city. And that way each rural area can still have a place where you can, one way we like to talk about this in planning is the park once model, where if you're going into town, you don't have to drive to each location separately, but you just drive to town and you park at the edge of town and everything's right there.
Since you mentioned, uneven levels of density, say lower ones in more rural areas, you had the diagram where you showed some areas might be quite dense. In recent years, in states like Hawaii and California with severe housing shortages, there do come available parcels of government-owned land that could be as large as 50, 100, or even 150 or 200 acres of contiguous land that can all be redeveloped basically from scratch. So how would you propose to redevelop a large government parcel like that? Would you still have a variety of different densities, or because of the severity of the housing shortage, would you want to maximize the density to as high a level as possible?
So in those areas where you have a large area to work with, that's where it does make sense to maximize it, because if you've got a large area, that means if you start in the middle of it, you don't have any immediate neighbors. And it also, the large buildings do benefit from the larger economies of scale. So especially if we're talking public social housing, it's, if we think about it, when we think about all the things that we get through mass production, whether it's your phone or your car or a can of soda, they make loads by the thousands. Whereas with housing, they're made by the dozens or the hundreds at most. And so there's not really as much of a economy of scale usually. And so if we really want to bring down the price of housing to one that more people can afford, it does make sense to have these very large scale places where tens of thousands of homes are built at a time. And we do see this in European cities where they build, instead of just a new development, they build entire new districts complete with the schools and the hospitals and the other services all at once. And you also see this in parts of Asia where the urban population is growing quickly, where entire new districts will be built at once.
We have a question from the audience on that topic of construction costs. Could you talk a bit about the construction costs of these different options? Construction costs per square foot or per unit may be higher for these super tall buildings. Is there a balance?
Sure, there definitely is. So some of the key break points in where the construction costs will jump is, the first one is from going from these low rise, smaller buildings to these mid-rise buildings at about 50 to 100 homes per acre. And the big difference here is that when you have these smaller buildings, most of the people will enter their house directly from the street, and therefore you don't need hallways. And the hallways can add another 15 to 20% of building that you need to build just so people can get to their apartment. And this is less of an issue in Hawaii because most construction is concrete, but on the mainland, because wood is such a common building material, there's also a jump in going from the mid-rise to high-rise buildings where there's a switch to concrete construction, which is more expensive. Right now in California, we recently allowed what's called mass timber, which is still built out of wood, but instead of your small 2x4s, you have these giant, massive beams and columns that might be over a foot in diameter. And that is something that California is now allowing for taller buildings. But one thing to think about in comparing the cost of building out housing, especially if you're building out a whole new neighborhood, is that the building is only a part of the cost. There's also the cost of the streets, the sewers, the power lines, and so on. And those costs right now, if you think about it, if you have 10 people living on a block, then everyone's got to pay for 1/10 of the cost of building that street. If you've got 1,000 people living on that block, that same cost is spread out over a much greater number. And so one way I like to think about it is that even though we might think that single family housing doesn't require too much concrete to build, it does because of all the bridges and freeways that are built to service it. And in general, it's cheaper to build elevators than it is to build highways.
That's a really interesting phrase, and I hadn't heard that before. It's cheaper to build elevators than highways. A good one to think about. Okay, we have another audience question. What are your thoughts on smart cities that use real-time data and machine learning to respond to issues in the city and manage city function with higher efficiency?
Smart cities, I haven't really looked too much into that. And I think one of the bigger challenges is that even a new neighborhood is not going to be completely from scratch. It does not exist in a vacuum. And so there's always the question of what happens if you have a smart city in one part of town, but then the rest of it isn't. And then later on when they do upgrade, is it going to be to the same standard or not? And one of the things I do in addition to the design side of architecture is I also do IT. And there's so many issues with just compatibility between different systems. And with something like a building or even a city being designed to last for decades, if not longer, I would say that the benefits of smart cities may be a bit overrated. But if you are going to do it, it's to always design for compatibility.
Okay, well, we don't have that much time left, so maybe we'll just take a couple more closing questions. First, can you please tell us about your experience as a Berkeley Planning Commissioner? What is it like now that you're in the bowels of actually making these land use decisions for the whole city?
Sure. So right now, the Berkeley actually has many different commissions. So in some cities, every project that is getting approved will actually go through the Planning Commission. But in Berkeley, we have a separate board for hearing the zoning issues. But what that does is it frees up the Planning Commission to look at some of these bigger, longer term things. For example, right now, it's looking at what we're going to do is these parking lots around some of our train stations. And it's also going to be looking at how Berkeley is going to meet the state required goals for identifying and creating sites for its regional share of housing production over the next 8 years.
And
so I would say that one thing that planning, that the real world of planning really is different than the more abstract, is that everything is a bit more complex, of course, because every site has its quirks. And especially with a built out city like Berkeley, most of the sites that are remaining that don't already have a building on them are the really weird ones. They're the ones that are often odd shaped or might have some interesting history to it. And so definitely that does get a lot more challenging with existing neighborhoods and adding housing to it. And that's why, again, going back to this picture, is that when you're looking at an existing neighborhood, it's always remember that not every lot, not every block is necessarily going to change. So you want to get the most out of the ones that are.
Okay, and here's a final question. So let's say we fast forwarded in time to the year 2071, 50 years into the future, and we see a headline in the paper that California's housing shortage is now over. What happened? What is the likeliest scenario that you think happened that actually brought us to the end of the housing shortage in California in that time horizon?
Sure. So I would say that the two things that would make that happen are a combination of funding and land use. So obviously you're going to need some homes that are built by the private industry, but you're also going to need the government to step up, just like it does for anything else we consider essential, whether it's schools or healthcare, or even things like fire safety, parks, and environmental protection. If it's something that you want to make sure everyone has access to, you're going to need some government involvement in it. And so I think in California that has solved its housing crisis, what you would see is that you would see both focus on getting more homes near places where people work, especially in places like Silicon Valley, where you've got giant office buildings with 20,000 people working there and only small houses around them. Those are places where you will want high-rise, high-density buildings. And then for people who don't have a high-paying tech job, that's where you'll also want the public housing and the social housing to come in. And one thing with social housing is where you've got a mix of incomes in a building. And the people who make more, they pay more. The people who make less, they pay less. And when you pull all that money together, there's enough to cover the cost of building and maintaining the building. So right now, we've got one of our state legislators, Alex Lee, an assembly member from Fremont, San Jose area, who's introduced a bill on social housing. And so I think that's going to be the first step towards really tackling this problem on a large scale. And I think with California in particular, we're a big state. And so one of our challenges is having something that will work in all of our different cities and suburbs. One of the advantages you have in Hawaii is you've only got one major city to work with. And so you can more tailor your policies towards that. So I wouldn't be surprised if you beat us to getting to solving the housing crisis. But again, it's a national issue, it's an international issue. And I would say that flexibility, but constant will to experiment and keep trying out new things and not giving up is going to be important politically for a lot of our housing bills in California. It's often a multi-year process where it starts out as a pilot program in a couple of cities, and then the state introduces a limited law, and then building on that success, it adds to that law. I would say a good example is the history of the accessory dwelling unit backyard cottages in California. It started out with a couple of cities allowing it, and then the state government said, you have to allow these. But at first it didn't apply to a lot of locations, and there are a lot of restrictions on it. For example, they could only be rentals. And it wasn't until this year that Senate Bill 9 passed that said that these backyard cottages could also be built for new homeowners instead of just new tenants. So yeah, take it one step at a time and just keep going.
Great. Well, California is the state of innovation, and hopefully a lot of the principles and concepts that are developed there will be able to spread all over the world. And I think that if there's one thing we've taken away from today, it's that these different levels have pluses and minuses, but none of them are inherently evil or inherently scary any more than any of the others, and that all of them are necessary to make a successful and thriving state and community. So thank you so much, Alfred, for bringing your renderings to us and for your thoughtful answers to our questions and for your years of housing advocacy in the Bay Area and in California.
Right, thank you.
All right, that's all the time we have. So we hope you'll join us for the next episode coming up for Our Homes Ending the Housing Crisis. Thank you again, Alfred.
Thank you.